I can't hear myself. I'm sorry. Message. All right. Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. The Gordon College Human Rights Group. We're so excited to have Ellis here and to have you guys here. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of background information about who Ellis is. Ellis Jones has dedicated his life to teaching others how they can be better stewards of this earth. Ellis has a PhD in sociology from the University of Colorado Boulder and is the author of two incredible books. His works include The Better World Handbook, Small Changes That Make Big Differences, and his other book, The Better World Shopping Guide, Every Dollar Makes a Difference. Currently, Ellis is a professor at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Mass., so he's pretty local. And we are so excited to have him here with us today. I hope that you guys can learn a lot and that you guys will be inspired. So here with us today is an honor to present Ellis Jones. I don't know what to do with that.
All right. Well, it really is a privilege to come out and get to speak and get to have you guys for an hour or so. What I'm going to do is I'm going to, talk, and we're going to do some things together for the next hour. And then I really hope, because it's my favorite part of these talks, I really hope that you have questions at the end, because I'm more than happy to answer, to the best of my knowledge, any of your questions. So today I'm really going to focus mostly on this idea of what is an ethical consumer and why is it important, and how is it that we as human beings need to engage the world in this way to make it a better place. We'll go over 7 basic guidelines, but before we get into that, and before we get into the books, and I'll just briefly mention my earlier book as well in a bit, I really just want to engage you in an activity if you'd be willing to do so. It's an exercise that I call Reconnecting Reality. So, if you will indulge me for the next few minutes, how it works is I need each of you to find a partner, and before you choose someone, let me recommend to you that you do not choose a person you know. And I know you're going to think to yourself, nah, I'll just choose this person right here, I'm fine. You will regret it if you choose the person you know. So pick somebody you don't know. So take a few minutes, and you'll have to sit next to them just for the exercise. Then you can go back to your seats with whoever. But you'll want a person you don't know, and trust me, you'll figure out why as the exercise moves forward. Go ahead, find somebody. If you know everyone, you can pick somebody you know the least well. The least well, the least, the better. The lesser, the better. Anybody else need a partner? Raise your hand. Is there still? Oh, well, then you'll be our observer. You will get the outside perspective. I'll come back to you to ask that perspective. So for the next few minutes in this exercise, you and your partner will have to, throughout the whole exercise, you'll have to hold hands. So I want you to reach across and grab each other's hands. Now remember that until the exercise is over, you have to keep holding those hands. You can't like break. So just so you know, it's only going to be literally like 5 minutes, less. It'll be 3 minutes, okay? So it may be awkward, but this is how it works. Okay, here's how it works. 3 minutes. I'll make sure, I'll time it. So since I'm promising 3 minutes, I will time it. What I'd like you to do is for the first 60 seconds, one of you is going to tell the other person your life story. You're going to talk about who you are, and I want this life story to include past, present, and a little bit of future. Like where do you see yourself? Where are you headed? Where are you going 5 or 10 years from now? You have 60 seconds for that. Then I'm going to say switch. And the other person is going to do that. They're going to, the life story in 60 seconds, okay? It looks like there's a new partner for you in the back. So that's another 60 seconds, okay? And then the final 60 seconds, I'm just going to have you, you're going to just look at each other. And I don't want you to say anything, okay? You get a break. But you have to hold their hands. You just have to look at each other, and I don't want you to make any noise. All right? That's the final, and that's the 3 minutes. Now, after that, you get to close your eyes, but I still want you to hold your hands because I'm doing a little visualization after that. So it's 4 minutes total, but, your eyes are closed. You feel a lot less awkward. Okay, so first just choose who's going to go first. Okay, now I will time this, so literally it will be 60 seconds, and I'll say switch, 60 seconds, and then I will say stop. And at that point, remember, you're just going to look at each other, no noises, and then I'll say, great, close your eyes, okay? So now we know how it's going to go. On your marks, first person, get set, and go. And switch.
Interesting. Okay. Is it the next 60 seconds?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Schooling was great. I did not specialize in anything.
And stop. Great, you did it. You can close your eyes. Okay. For the first part of this visualization, I'd just like you to try to picture the person you're with in your head and picture the story that they told you about their life. Can you remember the various things that they told you? About their childhood, about where they grew up, or went to school, maybe about their family. Also about what they're doing now. A bit about their future. Okay, once you have that clearly in your head, I'd like you to imagine the following scenario. Imagine that it's tomorrow, and that you come to class, and somebody is holding a local newspaper. And in the newspaper, it states that the person that you were holding hands with in this exercise, in this class, or in this lecture this evening, they were killed in a car accident. I'd like you to imagine, I know it might be a little bit of a challenge, imagine what kind of thoughts and feelings would come up for you if that were the case. Okay, well, luckily enough that didn't happen. You can open your eyes. Your partner is still here. They've survived that imaginary ordeal just fine. What I'd like to ask now, by the way, you've totally completed this exercise successfully. You guys were great. So very nice. Yeah, you don't have to hold hands anymore. And I'd just like to ask, it's only that last part of the exercise that I'm interested in. I know it's very awkward that I had you hold hands, and I know all that is very awkward. But that last bit, that last 20 seconds is what I'm really interested in. What thoughts or feelings came up for you in that last 20 seconds when I said, your partner had passed away? Anything somebody's willing to share? Like one thought? Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of shocking. It's, it's hard to wrap your head around. Good, what else? Yeah.
It's kind of sad,
Yeah.
even though we just met, because we kind of have, I now know about his childhood and he knows about mine. There's kind of like that small connection that I would wonder, I wonder how his family's doing, I wonder where he'll be, if there'll be a service, can I attend, and kind of sad because you don't really know that much about a person, but you've invested,
Yeah, great. So you know a little bit about the other person, and you begin to think about, their family, and then, you wonder maybe a little bit of what's missing. Anything else along those lines, or along other thoughts or feelings that came up for you? Yeah.
I think also, first of all, because I wouldn't see her. I would look and expect to see her once in a while because it's a small campus. I know I would question what the purpose of it.
Right. Yeah, it's meaningful, right? It's actually meaningful to meet other people, and it's meaningful even to create small connections, I think, with other human beings. Let me explain. I'm a sociologist, and so I study human behavior, and it's what fascinates me. I didn't create this exercise just to be sadistic. What I am getting at with this exercise is that we as human beings exist in a kind of bubble. And we know that each of us is real, just as real as we are. We know that intellectually. But how we operate on a daily basis is not the case. And so to kind of demonstrate this, what I do is I have you hold hands to create a physical connection. So you physically, the other person is definitely there because you're holding hands with them. And then when you look at them in the eyes, it creates another level of connection where, gosh, you feel nervous. They must be there. They're looking at you and you're thinking oh God, my hair okay? Or do I look funny? Or, What are they thinking? And so like that again kind of creates this sense that the other person's reality is suddenly right there, and you can't escape from it, and that's part of what feels uncomfortable, right? While you're sitting kind of, even if you're sitting right next to them, you can kind of feel like, well, I'm in my space, and they're in their space, and I'm having my thoughts, but when they're focused on you, and you can't get away, and you're holding their hands, like they are just as real, and it's hard for us to reconcile that, the reality of that other person right there, that connection. But it's important, because we know this is true. And it's also important that we can, in such a short moment, in such a silly exercise, we can actually create a human connection that is large enough or significant enough so that we would actually feel loss if that person were to pass away. Which means that they had meaning for us. Because people pass away all the time. But it doesn't have meaning for us. I'll give you an example, and this is why I use the exercise. Let me see if I can find this watch again. I keep putting it in my pocket. Oh, boy. All right. So, I think it's UNICEF estimates that every 3 seconds, somebody on the planet Earth dies of malnutrition. So that's now, and yet we don't feel it. We don't feel anything. Now, I propose to you that if people in this class began to die every 3 seconds of malnutrition, when the first person died, we would all be mobilized in this classroom. We would get up out of our seats and we would say, oh my God, what is happening? No, this can't happen. Is anybody else here hungry? Oh, look, I have this, eat this, or here, drink this, we would act. And it would be so significant that, oh my God, somebody just died and I was right there, that, nothing would stop you from acting because that's a part of who we are. But because these people are so far away, and they live across the globe in these other cultures that are so far away from us, and we'll never meet them, and our lives will never touch theirs in a way that we can consciously see them. It creates this situation in which we don't think of them as real. They're not like the people in this room right now. People on the other side of the planet that are dying, and by the way, they're dying. Malnutrition is one of these things that is very easy to solve. It's not like a very complicated problem. All you do is you provide food and the infrastructure to get it to the right people at the right time, and you can solve it with a particular amount of money and some political will. It's just not that difficult. It's not like trying to end war. That's tough. That's a toughie. It's going to take a while. No, getting people enough food and water, that's an easy one. But yet we don't quite have what it takes to get it done. And I propose it's partly because the people's reality is so low that it's not like the people in this room are starving, because if they were, we take care of them. It's not like the people at Gordon are starving, or even the people necessarily in the surrounding town, although if we start to get out and we start to see that reality fade a little bit, because we know that there's homeless problems, even within a very short distance of us. But you can see how that reality begins to fade enough for people to say, well, that's not real to me. Now, this is very important, I think, for us to wrap our heads around, because it's this disconnect which allows us to do things that that I don't think we would otherwise do. We are living in this age in which society has become completely globalized, totally interconnected. And yet we operate as if we still live at some level in villages in which we can talk with one another and see our connections. For lack of a better term, I just call this distance with a big D. It can be physical distance, geographic. It can be cultural distance, religious distance. It can be a distance of language. It can be all kinds of the distances that keep us apart or different from each other. But this distance adds up to a kind of intellectual insulation in which, on the one hand, while we live in this globalized world in which so much of our life comes from different parts of the globe, we don't see how we participate in this global system. We don't see it. We still feel like we're just participating in these little communities. Like, you probably feel like a Gordon College student. but you may not feel like you participate in, for example, the global marketplace, or that you have any impact on people's lives that are maybe farmers on the other side of the planet. But you do. The reality is you do. But because you don't feel it, most of us, sadly, end up in a kind of place of ignorance where we wreak havoc on the earth and on the various peoples of the earth without knowing it. Because we don't see them, and we don't have this connection. So I'd like to use this activity to talk about the importance of really reconnecting with that reality. Because, when we talk about something like ethical shopping, and you're like, well, there's the chocolate, and there's this other chocolate, and it costs twice as much, and it's got a little fair trade sticker on it or something, and you think like, well, I could get twice as much of that chocolate. It seems like a silly thing, right? Like a little thing. Like, when you're going to you're choosing a shirt that's orange or blue, it seems so small. And yet it's so important because it's having real impacts for people across the planet. And so I just want to connect us into that larger context. So when we can find ways to reduce this distance, we actually connect to the impacts that we're having. And we're ultimately more motivated to take responsibility. I'll tell you one of the ways that I came to this work in general is when I was young. In fact, it was I attended Catholic high school. I hated it, by the way. And I needed a way to get out of there. I was like, I got to get out of here. This is awful. And so I decided to go study abroad. And I thought that they were going to send me to Australia, and that's why I signed up. And they ended up sending me, when I was in the middle of high school, to Thailand. I didn't even know that Thailand existed in high school. We had to look it up on a map and so forth. But I went abroad, and I was a part of this really welcoming family and this wonderful culture halfway across the world. And I made these connections with both Thai people and also people that were in the exchange program, other high school students from all over the world, from Japan and Europe and Australia and everywhere. And I started realizing that connection. And later on, I would study abroad in England and go spend a summer in France to study human rights law. And then I would go do the Peace Corps in Central America. And I just found that I wanted these connections. And so when I see, for example, I was in Panama for 2 years in Central America. When I see Panama on like a clothing label, it's much more real to me, right? Because I've been there. I lived with those people, right? Some of them were from my community. When I see other countries on that label, I don't know. I think, Macedonia. I used to have my last coat was from that Macedonia. You see China or Bangladesh. Like, if you've never been to China or Bangladesh, you might think, well, it's another country, and that they just made some of my clothes, But you don't have that connection. But as we break this distance down, we really have much more of a kind of touchstone to this reality that we need to engage in to make the world better. Now, the first work I did was called the Better World Handbook. It was the big book. This is what I did instead of doing my dissertation in my PhD program. I just thought, oh, God, that PhD, that's just going to collect dust on a shelf somewhere. I want to do something that really makes a difference. And so I roped in a couple of colleagues, and we came up with the Better World Handbook. And this was a kind of compendium of how to answer the question of how can I make a difference in the world? What can I do as one person to engage around all of these crazy global issues? So, everything from human rights issues to the environment, to social justice issues, to what have you, like all of the issues of the world. How can I engage as an individual? So we broke down the book into kind of 3 basic parts. One is, how do you turn apathy into engagement? How do you bring hope back? And how do we get out of all those psychological traps that stop us from getting there? Like, I don't have the time for that, or I don't know enough about these problems, or, I can't really, what kind of difference can I make? I'm just one person, how can I solve racism or do anything for human rights, or et cetera? And the second part of the book is where we just break down the global problems of the world and begin to talk about a shared global vision of what it means to be for a better world. Like, what does that look like? We came up with 7 foundations, like comprehensive peace and ecological sustainability and deep democracy and social justice and revitalized community, etc. That these would all be things that we could be for if we were wanting to build a better world. And then the last and the biggest part of the book was really creating a kind of encyclopedia of actions. What you could do, when you're shopping, what you could do at home, what you could do with your family, what you could do when you're using media or getting involved in politics, like how you can use all these different realms of your life to engage somehow in an issue you care about. And for each person, it's going to be different. And some people are going to really engage in food, and other people, they're politically focused, and other people are going to engage more in certain issues and not others, but that we all come to the table with a contribution to make. So that was the first book. And out of that book was born the second book, The Better World Shopping Guide. It came out of 2 pages of the first book. The first book is like 400 pages, which is a shame in some ways, because one of our goals for the first book was to create something really handy and quick and practical, and then it turned into 400 pages. That's not handy or practical or quick. But there were 2 pages in the shopping chapter of this book that got more feedback than the rest of the book combined. And it was 2 pages in which my friend and I sat down and we started doing research on companies and started rating them from poor to excellent based on how they manufactured ice cream, how they created their soda pop, how they made their chocolate. And we looked at everything. We looked at environmental impacts and human rights and everything we could get a hold of to put them on this rating scale. And people were really interested. So I had always been interested in this stuff, and so when I found out that people were interested as well, I decided, well, maybe what we need is a more kind of comprehensive approach to this idea of, how do we rate companies? How do we find the companies that are really trying to move forward, that are trying to be responsible, that are trying to, help people and benefit our lives and the environment and other people around the world while we participate in this thing called the economy. And I ended up stumbling into what is now known as ethical consumerism. So this is where my talk is focused. It's 7 guidelines for the ethical consumer. I'll just go through 7. Some of these are very simple guidelines, but I think they're important. The first and most important guideline is to understand that money is power. It's like any other power. It's like electricity or political power or fame. It's just another form of power. It's essentially neutral at the beginning of things, but as it accumulates, it can become more problematic. So when power accumulates in one spot politically, we call that a dictatorship. When we spread it out amongst the people in a country, we call that a democracy. When it really accumulates in the economy in one spot, we call that a monopoly, right? So there are many ways in which we talk about power. And one thing I've been noticing over my years of study is that power was seeming to shift away from my old major as an undergraduate was international relations. That's, you could see, like, because Thailand and all of that stuff, I had a lot of fun and was really passionate. So I studied international relations, which later became international peace studies. But this is my international background. I was always taught that nation states were the most important unit of analysis in a global system, and that they are really political centers of power, these nation states. But what I saw over the past decade or two was that these centers of power were shifting from the political to the economic. And as they shift to the economic, one of the problems that we have to wrestle with, I think particularly as Americans, but people all over the world, is that when we look at power in the political realm, we have this wonderful thing that we've participated in and helped create called democracy, which is this way of dispersing power, to get it to everybody, right? So everybody has a vote, and so if anybody gets in and they're really awful, you vote them out, and you and I and all of us have a vote, right? So this wonderful way of dispersing power called democracy. In the economic realm, we don't quite have that. We don't have a dispersion of power. We don't have something called economic democracy. What we have is this economic system, and money accumulates in different spots, and power accumulates in different areas, and we have dollars. And so I would argue that we need to begin to think about something along the lines of, how do we democratize our economy? How do we democratize the global economy? I'm not sure we can get quite as far as we've gotten with political democracy, but if we don't confront this issue, and power shifts, as it increasingly seems to be shifting from the political to the economic, suddenly we're going to see our democracies eroding in light of these new power centers. So this is a kind of apples and oranges analysis that was done using World Bank data, GDP. You can see at the top, it's a funny comparison going on. It's gross domestic product, which is really kind of the economic engine for any particular country in any year, and sales, right? Sales for companies. And so the only real thing that they have in common, because they are kind of apples and orangey, is that they're measured in the same unit of analysis, and that is dollars. And if we agree that money is a form of power, then a dollar is a form of a unit of measurement of that power. So this, based on World Bank data in 2000, really is just a measure of power. And here we have countries, nation states, political centers of power, alongside corporations, economic centers of power. And I want you to notice that certain companies are starting to show up pretty high up on these charts. So the top 100 economic entities, according to this, include companies like General Motors and Walmart, ExxonMobil, Ford and Chrysler, Shell and Toyota and General Electric. Some of these names we know. And by the way, they just keep moving up on this list. In 2005, the same study was done, but looking at the top 150 entities. And now 95 of the top 150 are corporations, and 55 are countries. So that means, like, if Walmart were to declare itself a country, it would be the 22nd most powerful country, economically speaking, in the world tomorrow. So this is of concern. And we don't actually have really sophisticated ways of tracking this problem yet. I don't think we've kind of woken up exactly in the social science community as to how to track this issue properly. But we have at least some kind of broad indicators that there is something going on. So the second, maybe somewhat cliched after Spider-Man, guideline is that with power comes responsibility. And to some extent, we all believe that. We all understand that, we have a certain amount of power and we hold ourselves responsible to a certain extent. But, for example, the president has a lot more power. And we will hold him to a higher level of responsibility. Because if we make a mistake, maybe we get an F in a class. If the president makes a mistake, maybe 10,000 people die. That's a lot more responsibility, a lot more power. And so when we look at something like democracy, it's really just a system of trying to keep power accountable, trying to keep it accountable. And the way we keep it accountable is to disperse it so that we can all participate in keeping it to that responsibility standard. Now, when we look at bringing democracy to the economy, we don't have votes. We have dollars. And unlike votes, which are distributed equally in our country, for the most part, adults and people who aren't felons, and there are all these categories that we somehow marginalize out of voting, but otherwise we get one vote, one per person. So we've kind of equalized that power. The problem is, of course, in the world of dollars, you don't get $1 per person. You just get as many dollars as you happen to have. And at the moment, you probably think of yourself as not having that many. And as a college student, you probably don't have that many. But the average family in the U.S. has roughly, it's estimated, about 18,000 votes to cast a year, or $18,000 of consumable income that they spend on things other than, say, mortgages and rent and stuff that you can't really choose to, spend more or less ethically because it's just like taxes and so forth. And that if we could harness these dollars, we could literally reshape the face of the planet. One thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. economy, despite the rise of China, by the way, the U.S. economy is still the world's most powerful economy. It is number one, still, although it won't always be. The best estimates are that 2/3 of this economy, 2/3, is driven by one thing: consumer spending. That's all of the little dollars that you spend. That's when you buy a Coke at the vending machine. That's when you buy chocolate. That's when you go buy T-shirts at Walmart. All of that adds up to 2/3 of the most powerful economic system on the planet. So this is a very powerful vote. Not everybody has access to that kind of vote, but we do. Now, if we're looking at, how do we get this democracy to function? If we're talking about a kind of economic version of democracy, we have to begin to break down, how does our regular democracy function? And unfortunately, it's a kind of function/dysfunction that's going on. If you look at how everyday people in the U.S. gather their information for any particular election, there are really kind of three major sources that I would break it down into. The most common source of information is political advertising. So every year, your mailbox is filled with all kinds of ads, and the television is just, barraged with ads, and the radio airwaves. And by the way, every year it becomes increasingly more of an issue. Campaign spending is currently going absolutely through the roof, unprecedented levels of spending. Just to give a quick example, let's see, Bush, and who was the last person to run against Bush was John Kerry, yeah? Combined, all of the money they spent on their campaigns, both Bush and Kerry, combined together, Barack Obama spent more on his campaign than both of those combined. That's how in 4 years, campaign finance has changed. And it keeps changing that every year. It's not that you just break the record of the last year. You literally kind of exponentially break the record. And where does most of that money go? Most of it goes to advertising. To persuade people to vote a certain way. To buy the most sophisticated and persuasive and manipulative and wonderful and pleasant sounding advertising that will gain your vote. The second way in which voters gain information is through the media, right? Through headlines and interviews and debates and editorials. And we hope that the media can give us something better than advertising, right? The reporters are out there to do that. But increasingly what we've found, and you can see this in campaign years, is when an interview is held, that candidates are so sophisticated that they already have kind of canned responses, and their whole speech can be very canned. It's very difficult to get an authentic moment to even show up in the debate because of how well they are coached into saying the words that they know that the public wants to hear. So often we still lack that. And even in interviews, when they come on various shows, you'll hear the same thing over and over again. I'm strong on defense, and I believe in family, and I'm here to say that I'm going to take back America, and just that stuff over and over. Go watch old ads for campaigns that were won or lost. You'll find very similar stuff over the past decade or two. So that's not a very useful source. It can be somewhat useful, but it's getting less so. And finally, there is this last area, these trusted non-profits that may help us. Sometimes they are, our churches, our synagogues, or temples that we go to, and they help us kind of weed through, particular issues that candidates are for or against. Sometimes they're places like League of Women Voters that are trying to present you with this like unbiased information, kind of straight down the middle, straight shooting information. And sometimes it's maybe we're a member of Sierra Club or a member of Natural Resources Defense Council, and they know about the environmental stance of a candidate, and that's important to us, and so we go to them, we trust them on that issue. And they try to provide us with good information, but it's often these little bits of information. We don't get that big picture. I want you to get that in the economic realm, as consumers, we have almost the exact same thing going on. That the most popular form of information for products and services is advertising. It's what funds our whole system of television. It is all over the radio. Most of the radio is funded by advertising. It's all over the internet. It's in print. It's actually even on the product themselves. The products themselves are just advertisements for themselves. You pick up any product, and it's got a wonderful label. I mean, this is a little bit, but I mean, like this. Look how cool! It's like a little globe, and it's coming. There's the shopping bag, and kind of a little ad on the back. It tells you all about it. It's an ad for itself. This isn't information that is provided by an unbiased party. This is information provided by the most biased party, the one that is trying to sell you the product or service, the one that is trying to persuade and manipulate you. So by definition, it is the worst information. So when you want to buy a product or service, the worst place to go, for example, if you're concerned with ethical impacts, and whether something is environmental or socially responsible, or promotes social justice, or gives a living wage to someone, or is generally kind of will help a community out somewhere, the worst place to go is that company and their advertising. So you turn to the media, and the media is supposed to help to a certain extent. But the problem is that most of the media in this country is also a for-profit enterprise, which means that to survive, and you've probably been hearing the news over the last number of years, particularly since the internet and the proliferation of blogs and so forth, people have stopped buying newspapers as much. They've stopped subscribing to magazines as much. The news and the media is very desperate to recapture their audience. And they, for the most part, get an audience by having advertisers, proving that they have eyeballs on the screen or on their newspaper at any given time, and that allows for advertisers to have premium prices for their ads, which then fund the news or what have you. So, for example, media headlines are governed by this, and I also teach a course on media at Holy Cross. In many ways, if, for example, Ben & Jerry's were to come out and do something socially responsible or environmental or to help the local community, the bottom line is that's not really news. Ben & Jerry's does something good. Wow. That's what Ben & Jerry's does. That's the whole point of the ice cream, and that's how and then if somebody was to say, oh, well, Walmart has done something bad. Well, everybody kind of knows that Walmart does some bad things around there. It's not really that much news. I mean, they're always doing something that's probably bad in the world. But if Walmart does something good, well, now that's interesting, right? That's news. Walmart goes green is news. Or what if Ben & Jerry's is caught in a scandal? Good old Ben & Jerry's with their little halo, right? Now they're caught in some scandalous thing. They're doing something awful. Now that's news. That'll sell some papers. Because people go by and think, what, Ben & Jerry's doing stuff? I had no idea. Okay, I got to get this, and then they want to read it. So the problem with trusting, relying just on the media, because they operate under also for-profit principles, is that they won't always go with the story that's on the straight and narrow, but rather the story that will get them more readers or viewers or what have you. So the last place that we turn is labels. Back to kind of nonprofits for the most part. We get these labels like organic labels or fair trade labels. These are very important sources of bits of information. Or maybe the Consumers Union, which is everybody familiar with Consumers Union? They're the people who produce what? magazine, Consumer Reports. So, those people that just rate, whether or not the dishwasher or the MP3 player is high quality or it's going to break on you immediately or it's terrible or, all of that's all done by the Consumers Union. And they are, they're essentially built on trying to cut through this idea of advertising because you may be wowed by, the cheap price and the good-looking screen of the product and have no idea that when you drop $1,000 down for your new widescreen TV, that it's going to, as soon as you start trying to play with it, it's not going to function properly or something's going to go wrong or, it's terrible to fix or what have you. But Consumers Union can go out and test all that and then basically give you the straight and narrow on what's going on. So we have that. So in this project, what I've attempted to do is find all of the sources of information that exist. Most of them happen to be nonprofit sources. Some of them are privately funded sources, and a few of them are government sources, like the Environmental Protection Agency tracks a few of these issues, and collect all of their data that is available to each of us in these individual spots and put it together in one place. So there are roughly 50 sources currently that I use, and I go back about 20 years through their data. And through this, collect a kind of giant research project that allows me to get a picture of what these companies are doing in the grand scheme of things, not just in one particular way or from one particular assessment from a particular nonprofit or a particular group. And that brings me to guideline number 4, which is that sustainability is not just about the environment. That when we're talking about a better world, you can't just green the world up and then suddenly everything is solved. That when you really want to look at making a better world, you have to look at a number of things, the first of which is human rights. And all of these issues are issues that at some level connect with how we purchase. The fact that almost everything you're wearing right now was made in a sweatshop. I mean, the vast majority of every piece of clothing that you have right now was made in a sweatshop somewhere. That's currently how that particular industry has been, in a race to the bottom, to the point at which there's almost no choice left. It's not like there are even manufacturers that manufacture widely outside of sweatshops and give you this option that you can find at the mall, because you can't, bless you. Because you can't. And if you are to find something, you can find maybe organic socks that were made in the U.S. and not in a sweatshop, or, you can find some others, like a scarf, but you cannot find like a blazer. You cannot find the stuff that you use all the time. It's very difficult to find jeans. And if you do find it, let me tell you, you're going to pay through the nose for that, because you're used to paying $25, $35, $50 for a pair of jeans. So you think that's the real price. And so when somebody else is starting to sell it for $150, because that's what it costs to manufacture a pair of jeans in the U.S. With fair labor practices and so forth, that, you're thinking, I want to feel good about what I purchased, but I can't afford to feel that good. So human rights. There are, of course, environmental issues, which are very important, including global warming and pollution issues, etc. These are just, by the way, examples of a few of them. This is not a comprehensive list. There are issues of animal protection, how we treat animals in the processing of all of our products and services, how we treat communities, both our local communities and those communities that we interact with abroad, and then how we treat human beings in general, particularly in the workplace when it comes to issues of discrimination or issues of living wage or just basic health and safety issues. Something that came up recently on the news was that we've reached, I think, the 100th anniversary of what was called the Triangle Fire, the Triangle Shop Fires, in which 100 years ago, here in the U.S., we had, I think it was a textile factory, in which the factory owners decided that It was easier to keep all the doors locked to kind of cut back on like possible thievery and what have you. And then there was a fire, and everybody, a lot of people burned alive in the fire, a lot of the workers. And so we don't have that anymore. We have laws now in the U.S. to make so that doesn't happen here. But part of what has happened is that we've exported basically those plants abroad. So now, instead of us doing it, we have people in Bangladesh doing the exact same thing, locking the doors because it's easier. They don't have to kind of monitor, their workers and worry about, whatever it is they're worried about. They lock them in, and then they have fires because these things happen every now and then, particularly when the working conditions are not safe, and then people are burned alive, and it's awful, and it shouldn't happen. And it's just to do things like provide inexpensive T-shirts and, blue jeans and jackets. So it's important that we consider all of this, that we consider every aspect of kind of regaining our kind of human connection to the rest of the world. And so that's what this project is trying to do. At some point, if you want, I'll ask you, you can ask me about some of the detailed data that's also online for a lot of these categories. And we can go through some details. Like, for example, chocolate. I know you're going to watch a documentary later. We can talk a little more about chocolate. But like, if you want to see the breakdowns, not just the A through F grades, but the detailed data, we can take a look at that. So the fifth principle for ethical consumerism is that we have to move beyond boycotts and boycotts. Boycotts is kind of a funny word, but I'll explain here in a second. Boycotts are where we started. Boycotts are like, when Gandhi is in India and he's trying to shake off British rule, and they go and they start having marches out to the ocean to make their own salt, or they begin to weave their own fabrics. These are some of the original boycotts for justice, and then Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott. I mean, these are ways that we put economic pressure really by pulling our money away from unjust institutions. And you've heard of boycotts, and every now and then you may still hear of boycotts. Like maybe you have to boycott Nestle because of how they're marketing baby formula in the developing world, or maybe you have to boycott grapes from California when Cesar Chavez was around. So we understand this idea of like pulling power away. That's a boycott. A boycott is the opposite. It's when you push power toward companies, those companies that are doing good. So when you hear of something like Ben & Jerry's as an option for ice cream, and you think, you know what, I think I've heard that they're trying to do good things, both with their employees and the environment, and I saw they had some fair trade labels on some of their ice creams with chocolate in it. I think they're doing good stuff, and you push your money towards them. It's giving them more power. And then they grow, and they try to grow these practices so that it becomes more of a presence. The problem, though, is that there are only so many boycotts you can hear about, and only so many companies that you can keep track of in your head that oh yeah, they're doing really good stuff, so I really need to support them. You can only buy so much ice cream and toothpaste. So we need a strategy. I used to call it for a long time socially responsible shopping. Now it's called ethical consumerism in many cases. But what we need is a strategy to utilize all of our dollars to begin to have the option of more ethical choices for every dollar we spend. And if that can be made practical and easy and affordable within our budget, then we can really begin to use those dollars as a voice for social justice, for environmental sustainability, for revitalizing communities. And we can send that power. We can be these channels where every human being has so many dollars coming at them in any given year, and then they channel it out in directions that most of us don't even think about and don't know about. But when we don't think about and don't know about what we're doing, we end up with charts where Walmart can be the 22nd most powerful economic entity on the planet because we're not thinking about it. Or General Motors, and we can get to that in a second, but General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, become these incredibly powerful entities when we're not quite thinking, or we don't have the information to understand what the impacts are. So one of the points of this current system that I've been working on of how to create something practical for the average consumer is based on a relative ranking system. So as I mentioned earlier with clothing, almost everything is made in a sweatshop. And I apologize for blue. I don't know why it is that color doesn't seem to really like to be projected, but blue is always a tough one. But that there are choices, even within the world of sweatshops, even within the world of people not being paid quite enough, people not working in conditions quite safe enough, people not having the security that they need enough. There are differences between these companies and how they operate abroad. And some of them are trying to work in better directions. So, and some of them you'll recognize. I mean, while at the very top, you may not recognize, autonomy or no enemy or hempies or ecolution, right? These are stuff that you have to dig up on the internet. And even then, you're not going to find much outside of hemp shoes and, a crazy looking, pair of sweatpants and, just little things every now and then that you might be able to use. But then you get names that you recognize, like Patagonia is up there, American Apparel. And at the very top, used clothing stores. So I know you have, like a part of Human Rights Week, the clothing swap. It's a brilliant idea, right? Because the most responsible option is to not have those dollars sent out in the first place. Because part of this equation, and this is probably a question that will come up later, we can't save ourselves by ethically shopping. It's not like the answer to all of our woes. It's only even part of an answer to the economic equation. Part of it is a quality question in which we have to increase the quality of our consumption, so the ethical quality of what we purchase. But part of it is quantity. We have to reduce the quantity of our consumption so that we are living more simply and so that these dollars aren't accumulating so rapidly in this realm. So used clothing stores and/or clothing swaps are even better than some of these stores to be able to exchange and to get that kind of community and connection and renewal of your clothes that you got tired of after a while and you need new ones to wear. But you can see here, once you even get to the B level, suddenly you're looking at Levi's and Gap and Eddie Bauer, Timberland. These are names that you recognize. And that is significantly different from getting stuff from Kohl's or JCPenney or Macy's. And I think this is information that consumers need to have if they're going to begin to move their dollars in different directions. I just wanted to put up these charts. By the way, all these charts are available on the website. So you don't have to think like, oh my God, I got to write some of these down. No, they're all up there at Better World Shopper, and you can go anytime you want and get those. They're in the book as well, but you can get them online. I just wanted to mention this. It really stuck in my craw, the bailouts. For many Americans that did, the financial bailouts that we went through in 2008. And I just wanted to, there was something that I was beginning to see a pattern developing. These were the charts that came out in the 2008 edition of the shopping guide before the bailouts occurred. And they're very similar to the chart. They change very slowly, these rankings, from year to year, but they do change. But I want you to notice here what companies we ended up bailing out and where they rank. One of the things I don't look at all in this system is I don't look at fiscal responsibility, financial responsibility. It's just not on my radar. I look at social and environmental responsibility. I look at ethics, and whether or not they're balancing their own books is not something that I track. But I want you to notice that General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford are all D's and F's. And these are the companies that we bailed out. These were the ones that were making, and by the way, I want you to remember, on that other chart you saw, General Motors, one of the most powerful and profitable companies in the world. It's difficult to kind of wrap your head around that, but You can be very profitable in the short term by completely kind of cannibalizing your own company in the long term, or making really bad long-term decisions. So part of what, for example, General Motors was doing was saying, you know what, these giant SUVs, Americans love them, so we got to just keep manufacturing them, despite the fact that oil prices are going through the roof and all this other stuff, and people are becoming concerned about the environment and everything. They're like, we make so much profit on these giant SUVs that we just got to keep, we got to do this. I mean, it's going to go sooner or later, but we cannot, leave this profit on the table. And so part of what was happening was they were investing in all kinds of bad short-term ventures that weren't going to play out in the long term. And so they could be incredibly profitable. And then suddenly, from one of these most profitable companies in the world, become like a company that shows up at the table and says, you know what, we're going to go bankrupt. Sorry, could you bail us out? And then we as voters, we as taxpayers, we as citizens, suddenly, we thought that whole realm was taken care of. We thought like, well, if you succeed, then you get all the profit. And then if you fail, well then sorry, then you fail and you don't get any of your profit anymore. You just go under. But it turns out that when companies reach a certain size, that's no longer the case, because they end up playing such an important role within the rest of the economy that their collapse puts the whole system at risk. And that's why Republicans and Democrats, ultimately came together for the bailouts. Because it turns out that General Motors isn't just General Motors. It's not just a car company. It's so large and powerful, and they have all of these arms connected out. And this is part of what we look at in sociology, our systems. We think of them as individuals. We think of ourselves as individuals like, oh, GM is just this little company. It's one of many, and if it goes under, it goes under. No, because General Motors, I don't know if anybody saw Roger and Me, the original Michael Moore documentary. And he tracked about how his hometown of Flint, Michigan, where General Motors was founded, was basically decimated when General Motors moved all of its plants out, shut them all down, and moved to Mexico. And they were the most profitable car company at the time in the world, and they decided, we could use even more profit. So they shut down those plants, and that city of Flint, Michigan, just imploded. It imploded, the whole city, because it wasn't just about those plants. Those plants were the economic center of that city, and they connected to all the restaurants, because the people who worked at the plants then went out to the restaurants, and they connected to all the housing values, because people who lived in the town worked at the plants, and they bought the houses. So once you shut down those plants, all those people are suddenly unemployed. No one's going to restaurants. All of the housing values are dropping. No one's buying houses because there's nothing to do in Flint anymore. All of this stuff, there's a chain reaction, and then the whole city melts down. Flint, Michigan became the murder capital of the U.S. It became to the point at which the rat population at one point was estimated to have outstripped the human population in that city. And when our representatives saw General Motors and our big automakers, and then the banks, not just the banks, but some of the largest banks, like Citibank, Bank of America. These are some of the largest, most powerful banks in the world, and that they were asking for bailout money because they were having problems due to all kinds of, crazy investments, that they realized that our whole system was at risk. And that we suddenly, as citizens, became responsible for companies that were irresponsible. And again, here with the banks, again, I don't know how, I don't track financials. I just track social and environmental responsibility. But our biggest bailout recipients are Citibank, Bank of America, and none of them get higher than a C. These were the rankings after the news, by the way, just... so you can see they didn't change that much, just a bit. So we're getting close to the end. Excuse me. Next guideline, number 6. If we're going to be effective in this process of being ethical consumers, really trying to make a difference with our votes, with our economic votes, in this new world in which we are citizens and consumers at the same time, we have to target the most effective areas first, as a kind of starting point. We can't just suddenly tomorrow start spending all of our money in this highly ethical manner, and you need to go step by step. So we target the most effective areas first. We avoid the worst companies, so we make a kind of mental list of those companies we're going to avoid, support the best companies, and then we work up from there, maybe category by category. Maybe we start to say, okay, let's see, this month or this week I'm going to work on figuring out chocolate. I'm just going to do that. I'm going to figure out what kind of chocolate is ethical and not, and how much can I afford, and where could I get it if I, and maybe you come up with a compromise, and maybe you say like, oh, my budget is, I'm either going to have to cut back on chocolate, or I'm going to have to get half from this A company, which is expensive, but another half from maybe a C company, which isn't as good, but it allows me to have the amount of chocolate that I need to be happy in the world, because it's important to find a balance. So part of what I also put on the website in the book are these top 20 lists to give consumers an idea of this. By the way, this database is huge. It has 1,732 companies currently. It's massive. It's a big mess in that it's very unwieldy to put online. But I can tell you who scored at the top and who scored at the bottom based on how this system works. And these are the ones that scored at the very bottom. ExxonMobil, Kraft, and Walmart are kind of the top three. Chevron, Texaco, General Motors. You'll actually remember these from the first chart, some of them. These are some of the most profitable companies on the planet, and they're profitable for a reason. When profit comes before absolutely anything else in the world, you can make all kinds of money. When you start to say, you know what, I'd like to make even more money there, but I'm just going to make this amount of money, and we're going to support that community. Or we're going to create quality jobs. Or we're going to, not pollute this environment until it's toxic. So often those are expensive choices. So you can see many companies up there. Then the 20 best. Again, I have to apologize for blue. It's kind of like eye-melting blue. Seventh Generation, Method, Organic Valley, Cliff Bar, Aveda, Tom's of Maine, Dr. Bronner's, King Arthur Flour, Earthbound Farm, Dansko Footwear, Patagonia Working Assets, New Belgium Brewing, Nancy's Dairy and Soy, Endangered Species Chocolate, Honest Tea, Earth Friendly, Annie's Natural, Eden Foods, and Ben & Jerry pulling up number 20. That's the large list, by the way, and there's a small list. Because large companies tend to have more data on them, and so these are companies you may never have heard of, but they're worth looking up. Shore Bank Pacific, great socially responsible bank. New Leaf Paper, a wonderful paper company that supplies photocopy paper and paper to write on. Yeah. Guayaki is a tea company, and they provide yerba mate tea in bottles. Better World Telecom is a long-distance phone company. Numi Tea is a regular tea company. Alter Eco makes all kinds of little products, fair trade, rice and cocoa. They have a great chocolate. Recycline, they make things out of Stonyfield Farms recycled plastic yogurt cups. So they make razors and toothbrushes and all kinds of things out of recycled yogurt containers. So their whole material to begin with is a kind of environmental positive. Equal Exchange at number 8. They are the coffee, chocolate, nut manufacturers or makers. 10,000 Villages, you may have heard of them. They're a wonderful fair trade company that works directly with artisans in the developing world. And then Better World Club, which is an alternative to the American Auto Association, like AAA, getting AAA for your car, being able to call up AAA and get the tow truck out. Better World Club is an alternate version of that. And top 10 things to change, and this list has not changed since I began the book. So since 2006, when the first edition of the shopping guide came out, and this was many years before the bailout, number one has always been bank. If you're looking to change one thing, I'd recommend changing your bank. I recommend it because it is a one-time change. You don't have to kind of keep repeating it over and over again every month. You don't have to go find that fair trade chocolate again and again. You do it once. It's a bit of a pain when you do it, but once you do it, it's done. And once you do it, it's kind of wonderful because whether you have, $10 or $100 or $10,000 in that account, it doesn't just sit there, right? When you go to the ATM or you go online, it looks like it's there, but it's not there. Because some of this we learned in high school, and some of this we learned in the financial bailouts, but that money is not there. That money is invested all over the world. in projects that you have no idea what your money is doing. But when it's in a socially responsible bank, every night when you go to bed, that money is working. And it is working to put up another windmill for some alternative energy project, or it is working to put up to help people create small businesses in an inner city community that would otherwise not get loans, or it is out there, going to some part of the developing world, helping people create a water project, or it is out there doing, and all of these things it's doing while you're sleeping. You don't even do anything with it. You just sit there and you say like, oh gosh, yeah, boy, $100, that's better than last month that I had in my account. That's all you do, and it does that work. And there are options. Not every community has a socially responsible bank that was built on its social responsibility, but at the very least, it's worth getting it into, say, local credit unions, which tend to have different regulations on how they can invest their members' dollars, and thus are less likely to be involved in things like the investments that are problematic around the world. Gasoline is another easy one. On this first 3 rows, there are these little wallet cards that you can come grab for free if you didn't sit in this for 3 rows over here. And they just have like a little A through F ranking of gasoline stations. And it's an easy way to kind of funnel your money. Gasoline costs the same almost wherever you go. It's like 10 cents difference between the 2 corners. It's not a better or worse product. Consumer Reports has done research over and over again. There's no better gasoline to put in your tank. So it's really an easy one, as long as there's something within range. The best one closest to us is Sunoco, if you've ever seen or heard of that gas station. Supermarkets and retail stores, because they take a cut off of almost anything you spend. But cars and seafood, cars for environmental reasons for the most part, seafood, we can get into, global ocean ecosystem destruction later if you want. Chocolate and coffee are the 2 major fair trade products in the world. And credit cards, back to the banks a little bit, and cleaning products. Credit cards are also interesting, though, because you can get credit cards where every time you use it, part of it is donated to, say, a particular nonprofit organization of your choosing. So I have one that's like Natural Resources Defense Council. Like a very small percentage is donated not out of my pocket, but out of theirs. Something like 0.5%. But if I spend $1,000 every year on that card, that's $50. That goes to a nonprofit that I think is doing good work that, I wouldn't otherwise give that $50 to necessarily. And this gets me to the very last guideline for ethical consumers, and that is to make sure that each of us understand that our contribution will be a unique one. That this project, just like democracy in the political world, is not about having everyone vote the same or vote in lockstep, but rather that they vote their conscience, that they vote according to their own situation in their life, their own principles, their own values, their own ability to support whatever it is that they support. Because there are always trade-offs to be made. You have many ideals, but then there are realities, like your budget. Your ideals and your budget don't always come together perfectly, so you have to make some trade-offs. And you will never be perfect in your shopping. You will never become this perfect A-plus consumer that is just constantly, funneling all of your dollars all the time into the most wonderful projects in the world. To be honest, my goal when I get up every morning is that my ethical shopping GPA comes in at a B+ for the year, and I try to challenge myself to meet that standard overall. You'll have to develop some personal strategies on your own. So, for example, when I started buying organic stuff in the supermarket, I couldn't really afford to get organic everything in the produce section, so I said, okay, I'm just going to start with bananas, and then I'll go from there. And so every time I would go and I'd just get bananas. I'd get all the other stuff, it just wouldn't be organic because I couldn't afford it. But then I worked my way up, and pretty soon, I wasn't a poor student anymore, and then, I was a professor, and so suddenly I could afford more things, and I had more options, etc. And then it's really, the last thing I want to say is it's important to communicate your success and your failures to other people in this realm. So for you to say, you know what, I feel really bad. I just cannot find, I don't know, I've been looking everywhere. I love tea, and I cannot find an ethical tea company to save my life in this town. And then somebody else will say, you know what, I have the same problem, I have no idea. But I had trouble finding chocolate, and you know what, there's this great place just down the road, and they happen to sell, Equal Exchange chocolate down there. Oh, I had never heard of that. Yeah, really? That's just as important as you being able to communicate to somebody like, oh, look, I just switched my bank, and I have this great bank now. That's important too, but it's important to say like, I don't know of, or I'm struggling with this other particular aspect of my own ethical consumerism, so that you can share that with other people. And some people can come up with interesting strategies, like the clothing one, I think is so brilliant. This whole clothing exchange idea. I mean, again, most of those companies that create clothing from the ground up, they're involved in some kind of sweatshop around the world. And so this just becomes like this wonderful way of, simplifying, taking some of that money out of the equation and building a little community in the process. And it's very creative, and you're able to engage these problems in ways that aren't just black or white, like, you know what, I'd love to get X, Y, or Z, but I just cannot afford it, or I can't find it. So I will end with that, and just to let you know that last summer I collaborated with a colleague in Boulder, and we were able to put together an iPhone app. So it's one thing to create a little shopping guide that you can put in your pocket, but even something like this is not going to be in your pocket all the time. And to be totally honest, I don't carry that around anymore, but I do have my iPhone on me all the time, and so having the app is really handy because I'm running the supermarket, I'm trying to get like the other night I was trying to get taco shells and salsa verde, and I was like, oh God, I get my iPhone app out, I'm like, taco shells, I don't know, and I start typing in, and pretty soon I get okay, that company is my best option. It's a B-, but it's what I got because there's only a Shaw's near my house. So that app is available, I think it's $2. It's available for iPhone people, and that's it. So, I had no idea how much time I spent on that. I know I went over probably by a lot. But I would love for you to ask questions and to try to give you some of my best answers. Yeah?
You mentioned that a lot of clothing you buy from sweatshops in other countries. I was thinking of how that would be that, I would think that if we stopped buying their clothes and they just have better jobs if they didn't work in the sweatshop?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a very common question. So the question was, if we stopped buying clothes from sweatshops, wouldn't the people in those countries basically be out of jobs? And the kind of mythology of the world of sweatshop labor is that, these companies are coming in and, very benevolently, handing out jobs to these people who would otherwise starve themselves to death. And they come and they get these little wonderful jobs. And then when their standard of living is up high enough, then they move on to some other poor country where they need jobs because they're starving, and then they move on. And so there's this kind of benevolent mythology. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, that is a common myth that is perpetrated by the companies themselves. What's really happening is that they're looking for cheaper and cheaper labor sources. So, Mexico, you have to pay them $2 an hour. So then you find some place like, Vietnam, and that's like 50 cents an hour. And then they say, but Bangladesh, boy, they're 25 cents an hour. So they're not moving out of this benevolent option. They're moving because they were able to create even more profit. And they're in this kind of downward spiral. These different industries get into these different competitive spirals. And in the clothing industry, there's this downward spiral that has been happening for a number of years, that the competition is so intense that they end up moving to the very kind of bottom of the ladder. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is probably the most important, if you go and you look at organizations, websites that are anti-sweatshop organizations, that are the ones campaigning for you to change how you spend and for companies to change what they do. Almost never will you ever see an organization calling for the elimination of the shops. They're not calling for you to either eliminate all your sweatshop spending dollars, nor are they calling for the companies to close all their shops down. Generally, what they're calling for is they're calling for those companies to pay their workers a living wage, first of all, for that country. It doesn't look like our country. It doesn't look like $10 an hour or whatever it would be, in the U.S. So they're not asking them to pay people in Bangladesh $10 an hour. What they're asking them to pay often is something like the difference between, 25 and 50 cents an hour in Bangladesh. One being poverty wages, and the other being a living wage. And they're also asking them to do things like stop locking the doors. When there's risks of factory fires, they're asking them to stop firing people when they get pregnant. They're asking them to stop, things that we all take for granted. So they're asking them to put in place systems, principles, working conditions that most American consumers assume are kind of already in place and will ultimately, cost that company a little more in profit, but will not run them out of business by any means, and will not, end up having the consumer, charge triple the price, and also will not put those people out of work. So that's what most of the sweatshop campaigns are asking. So it is important for us to break out of that original dichotomy of thinking, well, it's either that job or no job, because there are many more options. That's a great question. What else?
So then what does that mean for buying? Oh, yeah. So what does that mean as far as buying clothes then?
So what that means for buying clothes is that it's better to support those companies that are trying to make those efforts already. So there are companies in which they spend time and energy and money on tracking the conditions in all of their manufacturing facilities, trying to improve them, having third-party organizations verify those improvements, and work with some of these sweatshop organizations to kind of move the whole industry forward. Maybe slowly, because it's a huge industry and there's a lot of money and they're in this downward spiral, but surely in that direction. And so there are companies like Levi's and like The Gap that are by no means perfect companies, but that are involved in processes to try to bring that industry out of that spiral. And then on top of that, what it means is when you can find options like, stuff that's made in the U.S. or locally made, or when you can find them every now and then, that it's important to support those options as well. So that it's a little bit like our energy problem. It's not going to be solved by like one silver bullet or one particular type of action, like solar isn't going to save us. But it's this kind of combination of things. Like in this alternative economy, which could exist, which really moves us to a better world, which works for us rather than against us. Ultimately, we will have both large, medium, and small companies. And so what we need is an alternative paradigm for small companies, like little small green companies to flourish, medium-sized companies, and even large companies to turn around slowly but surely and start moving in the right direction. And to be able to reward companies at each level doing those things right, to move their industry in this other direction. Great questions. Yeah, one up here.
You said about maybe spending more money on a product to ensure that you are buying an ethically produced product. But then I have the dilemma, like, if you're spending more money, is it not better to buy something cheap and then give that extra money to maybe a charity that's doing good work in another field?
Right.
And how do you kind of...
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So... Well, a couple of things. First of all, I think it's a great question in theory. I think in practice it's actually hard to play out correctly. Very few of us would actually set aside the difference between the higher amount of money and the lower amount of money in a fund to then spend. But theoretically, that is possible. And there may be a small percentage of people that are willing to do that. Most people are probably not. It's actually fairly complicated to kind of go first research that and then play it out. But ultimately, I think it's probably... I think I would still recommend it against it, even if it were something that I thought was practical for everybody to do, to kind of like create this piggy bank in which they're putting all the money that they're not going to spend on this and buying the cheap product, because problematically it's rewarding the companies that are just doing the kind of cheap and easy thing, which is often correlated with the socially irresponsible thing. So it's rewarding them for their behavior. And then hoping that the kind of nonprofit sector can somehow outweigh the for-profit sector. And part of what we need, I think, is we need models in the for-profit sector that begin to move that sector in the right direction as well. The nonprofit sector, in many ways, is already moving in the good directions. But what we need are models that work. And there are companies out there, large and small, that are now models for what it means to be a much more responsible company. And if they can just bend the ear of the consumer and communicate that integrity in a way that people can hear it and see it and support it, that will allow them to create this model. It's already in part working. I'll give you an example. Little green companies, particularly socially responsible but also environmentally responsible, are constantly getting gobbled up in the past 10 or 20 years by larger companies. They're getting gobbled up and bought out and purchased by these larger companies because they are, in fact, so profitable. Because there is such demand from a consumer level for these more green options, these more ethical options, that it is a kind of constant battle. And so there's already a system in place in which large companies are realizing how profitable it can be to be ethical. And then the real challenge becomes when those companies realize that it's even more profitable to not be ethical, but just pretend that you are ethical by having good PR campaigns. And so as a consumer, that's what we really have to watch out for. We really need to be able to reward those companies that are actually moving forward with our dollars and avoid those that are pretending.
This isn't really so much of a question, but it's more of like a comment, if that's okay. You mentioned how like simplicity is really key in kind of changing the system, and I was just thinking about how like there's a lot to be said about that, and that's kind of at the core of the whole problem in the first place, in recognizing like that all of these problems are really a result of the root evil of gluttony and of greed, and I think there's a lot of like hope in that, and realizing that a grassroots kind of movement to go back to actually enjoying what we do have and desiring less is really, really powerful in changing the system at large. So I just thought that was really helpful. Yeah. So thanks.
No, and I completely agree. And one thing that I definitely want to emphasize again in this presentation is that this is only part of the equation, that this is the quality aspect. So you increase the quality of your consumption while reducing the quantity. All of the simple living movement people and the voluntary simplicity people, like they have the other piece of that puzzle. The problem is even if you simplify over and over and over again, you cannot completely simplify your way out of the system. There is always something you have to buy sooner or later. There's always some way in which you participate. And even if that's only $1 a year or $10 a year or $100 a year, it's important that that dollar or those 100 or whatever that is spent in an ethical or quality manner. And for most of us, it's still more like 18,000. So it'd be nice if we get 18,000 down to 9,000, down to 5,000, down to, and some people are going to be able to do that. And that contribution, again, is going to be that unique balance. But, point well taken, that those two have to go hand in hand. You can't solve the problem of all the problems that stem from overconsumption simply by shifting that consumption. You have to reduce it and shift it at the same time.
All right. Well, can I speak into this? Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to thank you and thank Ellis Jones for coming out today. coming.
Thanks for having me.
I just wanted to mention a couple of things. We are having a movie screening a documentary screening of The Dark Side of Chocolate. It'll be in Barrington, room 138. And right after this, there'll be fair trade coffee, fair trade chocolate, and some snacks and some tea for you guys to have, because I know it is around dinner time. So we would love for you guys to join us. And
one other thing before I forget, if you're interested, Better World shopping guides are available up here for half price. They're $5 each, and the handbooks are $10 each. So if you'd like one or the other, you're welcome to get some before you go, or just come up and talk to me afterwards, and I'm happy to chat more.
And lastly, there's chapel credit up at the top. I know it's missing something, so you guys can go and sign up for that. So thank you.
Thanks.